Hi everyone, my name is Anuj Jindal. I welcome you to this session. Today I want to talk about the economic reforms of 1991. We've already talked about the causes behind the crisis, but we have not yet talked about the LPG, the all famous LPG reforms. Today I want to give you a very holistic picture about the LPG reforms, how they were carried out, what were the impacts, what came under LPG reforms. अब LPG reforms से रेगुलरली क्वेश्चंस आते रहे हैं एंड इट्स अ वेरी कॉन्सेप्चुअल थिंग जहाँ पे उतनी अंडरस्टैंडिंग नहीं है जितनी हो सकती है. लुकिंग एट एलपीजी रिफॉर्म्स कैन ऑल्सो बी फ्रॉम अ डिफरेंट लेंस. नॉर्मली हम लोग एलपीजी रिफॉर्म्स में बस लिबरलाइजेशन, प्राइवेटाइजेशन, ग्लोबलाइजेशन डिवाइड कर देते हैं, but they can also be divided as stabilization reforms and structural reforms. And normally, that is how questions are transforming over time. Whether you're talking with somebody or you're just in the examination hall, conceptual, deep understanding about LPG reforms will help you everywhere. So in today's session, through a lot of mind maps, not through a lot of content, I will try and clear the entire LPG reforms to you in one single class. So let's begin. We've already talked about the causes in another session. You can have a look at it from the link in the description below. We've already talked about the causes behind the crisis that happened in India in 1991. Let's now try to understand how the LPG reforms came into India and what happened after that. Now, when India approached IMF as well as World Bank or IBRD, it is also called as International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. तो जब इंडिया ने IBRD और IMF को अप्रोच किया, they approved a loan of $7 billion, but this loan came with certain conditions. Now, what were these conditions? Number one, they said that we want you to carry out 3 reforms in 3 different dimensions, which we are going to call as liberalization, privatization and globalization. अगर हम briefly समझने की कोशिश करें what exactly happened in all of these one by one, तो लिबरलाइजेशन का मतलब था, लिबरल क्या होता है? लिबरल इज विदाउट एनी और विद लीस्ट रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस. So that is what came under liberalization. The government was told to reduce rules and regulations on various aspects, जहां पर उनके रूल्स बहुत ज्यादा हैवी हो चुके थे. That was collectively called as liberalization. Liberalization करने का आउटकम था that private sector could get a growth. Private sector could grow. Before liberalization or due to lack of liberalization in India, the private sector was not getting a chance to grow. So this was the outcome. लिबरलाइजेशन के अंदर मेजरली हमने लाइसेंस राज को खत्म किया, जो अभी हम नीचे देखेंगे. वी जस्ट ट्राइड एंड रिड्यूस द अमाउंट ऑफ licensing that was required in order to create or start any enterprise or any kind of activity. Second step that was required by the government was privatization. Privatization का मतलब था जो गवर्नमेंट का इन्वॉल्वमेंट है इन वेरियस सेक्टर्स दैट नीड्स टू बी रिड्यूस्ड. इसके अंदर हमने डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट किया, प्राइवेटाइजेशन किया, वॉलंटरी रिटायरमेंट स्कीम लेके आए, बहुत सारे स्टेप्स लिए. व्हाट वाज द ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ दिस? एज आई सेड, द ऑब्जेक्टिव वाज टू रिड्यूस द इंटरफेरेंस ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट इन वेरियस एंटरप्राइजेस, जो कि आज हम बोलते हैं मिनिमम गवर्नेंस, minimum government, maximum governance. That was what privatization was all about. And the third step that they required from India was to globalize. Globalization का in short अगर मैं बताऊं तो मतलब था integration with global economy. All the steps that Indian government was required to take to integrate its own economy with the global economy, उसको हमने globalization का नाम दिया. इसमें ट्रेड बैरियर्स रिड्यूस करना वाज वन ऑफ द स्टेप्स. देयर वर मल्टीपल स्टेप्स जिसको हम एक एक करके डिस्कस करेंगे. सो दिस इज व्हाट आईएमएफ टोल्ड अस टू डू एंड वी डिड दैट बिकॉज वी नीडेड द मनी. उसके बाद हमने फिस्कल पॉलिसीज में भी ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन किया, व्हिच मेंट दैट वी रिड्यूस्ड आवर एक्सपेंडिचर एंड वी ट्राइड टू increase our revenue. By we, I mean the government. So the government was told to reduce its expenditure and increase its revenue. इसको हम आज austerity measures भी बोलते हैं. Something that was done after the 2008 global financial crisis by different countries. Austerity measures are also the same thing, approximately the same thing. And the impact of all of this was that India's economic reforms kick-started, and ultimately we saw ourselves getting integrated with the global economies. So this was the entire sequence of events. It's very simple to understand. The core of these reforms is LPG. Let's try and understand liberalization first, and then we'll get to privatization and globalization. तो liberalization के अंदर आपको ये सारे reforms दिखेंगे. These are all the changes that were brought about as a part of liberalization. The first is industrial licensing. As I said, license Raj system, which had resulted in red tapeism in our country. So the outcome was red tapeism, कि आपने एक फाइल दी और उस फाइल को 10 महीने 11 महीने 2 साल भी पड़ी रहती थी फाइल्स बिफोर गिविंग आउट द लाइसेंसेस. This resulted in a lot of red tapeism as well as corruption in the bureaucracy. So it was decided to liberalize industrial licensing. अगर आपको कोई भी इंडस्ट्री स्टार्ट करनी है, you do not need so many licenses anymore. We try to reduce the number of licenses required from all these businessmen. Now, all of this right now is famously also called as ease of doing business. आजकल पीएम मोदी काफी बोलते हैं ease of doing business कर रहे हैं हम. What is that? That is basically reducing license requirements, whatever exist, even them, and even where they exist, try and reduce the timeline of those licenses. All of that comes under ease of doing business, and it is broadly a part of liberalization policy only. This was the first major step. Second, हमने liberalization के अंदर क्या किया? Export import policy को change किया so that we could liberalize import and export rules. अब import and export में क्या होता है? First of all, you need license in order to import and export. Secondly, you need to exchange foreign currency. This was the major problem with India. You need to exchange foreign currency, foreign exchange. तो जब आपको forex में, if you want to import in dollars, if you want to import something and pay in dollars, you have to convert your rupees into dollars. For that, before 1991, people or businessmen had to take permission from the government, had to apply for exchanging their currency. That used to take a lot of time, and because of that, a lot of importers and exporters were not able to do their job. तो लोग import export करना नहीं चाहते थे because it required a lot of licensing, a lot of permissions regularly. Even if you are importing regularly, after every import or after every export, you have to take permission again from the government. So export import policy did not allow free exchange of currency. That was changed. Similarly, licensing in order to import and export majority of the things, that also was abolished after this. So this was a major portion under import export policy. Third was technology upgradation. Now before 1991, it's a very famous interview by Nandan Nilekani, and he had said that before 1991 we wanted to import certain computers for our company Infosys, but it took us more than a year just to apply and get approval of importing those computers, and we did not even get approval for all the computers. So just to import something as basic as a computer, they needed permission of the government, and even for that they had to wait for a year to just finalize their import from another country. So technology upgradation was not happening. Why? Because Indian government was not very favorable in importing technology from other countries. Why? Because it was expensive. It would have meant loss of foreign exchange for India. What was the outcome? The outcome was that we were using obsolete technologies because our country was not able to create such technologies indigenously. So ultimately we were relying on obsolete technologies or no technologies at all, in fact. So technology upgradation changed all of this. We liberalized the way technology could be imported and used if there was a requirement. The next liberalization reform that we carried out was fiscal and financial policy reforms. फिस्कल का क्या मतलब होता है कि आप अपने एक्सपेंडिचर्स कम करो और आप अपने रेवेन्यूज बढ़ाओ. इसके अंदर द मेजर रिफॉर्म दैट वी गॉट आउट वाज FRBM एक्ट. FRBM एक्ट, फिस्कल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी एंड बजट मैनेजमेंट एक्ट, 2003 में पास हुआ था, विच पुट पार्लियामेंट्री रेस्ट्रिक्शंस ऑन द गवर्नमेंट टू रिड्यूस और लिमिट देयर एक्सपेंडिचर्स, कि हम अपना एक्सपेंडिचर इससे ज्यादा नहीं कर सकते. That was the first major fiscal policy reform that was carried out as a part of liberalization. So सरकार ने बोला अब से हम अपने खर्चे कम करेंगे, हम अपने रेवेन्यूज बढ़ाने की कोशिश करेंगे, and wherever we reduce our expenditures, we'll try and liberalize it so that the private sector can come in and make those expenditures. Second major change that we brought about here was change in financial policy, जिसमें हमने autonomous institutions create किए. So as a part of liberalization, we created a lot of autonomous institutions, independent institutions. For example, SEBI was created in 1992. For example, IRDAI was created in 1999. So these individual autonomous independent institutions were created in order to handle the financial system so that the government did not have to interfere in every financial task or every financial decision that had to be taken. So this was a major financial policy change that comes under liberalization. And finally, we carried out foreign exchange and investment policy reforms. Foreign exchange के अंदर we ultimately allowed complete current account convertibility. मतलब अगर आपको import या export करना है, you did not take permission from the government anymore to any extent. And we allowed partial capital account convertibility, which means if you want to invest somewhere or someone from foreign country wants to invest in your country, then they can do that, or you can also do that. You just have to take some very brief little permissions from the government. Okay, those permissions were also liberalized to a very large extent, जिससे कि आपको बार बार सरकार के पास ना जाना पड़े, and there are time limitations also. And plus, it was also combined with these autonomous institutions so that you do not even have to go to the government. You can simply go to SEBI or RBI in order to get those permissions. That makes it even faster. And finally, investment policy reforms, where we allowed foreign investment to come to India in both FDI format and FII format. मतलब हमने foreign direct investment को भी promote किया, which means other companies can invest in India, buy Indian companies or enter into greenfield investments in India, जहाँ पे वो नया industry, नया business setup कर सकती है India में by investing in India. And second was foreign institutional investors who want to invest in the stock market. उनको भी permission दी गई that after applying with SEBI and after getting registered with SEBI, you can very well participate in Indian stock market as well. 1991 से पहले ऐसा नहीं होता था because we were very finicky about this, that if foreign investors, foreign individuals, foreign countries and companies start doing this, automatically the control of Indian enterprises, the control of Indian companies will go into foreign hands. And that is why we were very strict about it. But now this has been changed, and you know, India is one of the largest destinations of FDI and FII. So this comes under foreign exchange and investment policy reforms. So this one graph summarizes the entire liberalization policy, and I believe this is going to be very, very helpful for you. The second change that we brought about, second major reform, was the policy of privatization. Privatization के अंदर क्या क्या आता है? Number one, the objective, as I have told you, privatization का मतलब था कि जहां पर wherever the government was involved, उसको हमने eliminate किया. हमने सरकार को बोला कि आपको ये सब करने की जरूरत नहीं है, let the private sector do it. Now, how would you ask the government to go back, to take a step back and not to produce those goods? For example, the government used to create watches, HMT watches. The government used to create or manufacture bread. The government used to manufacture cars. ऐसी चीजें आपको करने की जरूरत नहीं है. The private sector very well can create or manufacture these things. The policy in order to change this was, number one, called as disinvestment. Number two, autonomy to PSUs, and then there were some other measures. Disinvestment के अंदर क्या आया? The government started selling the stake in its companies to the private sector. If the government sold everything, the entire stake, including its control over that company, that would be called as privatization. Whereas if the government sold partial stake, where it has more than 51%, or even if it has less than 51%, it has control over decision making of that enterprise, then it would be called as disinvestment. So ये major changes किए गए disinvestment के अंदर. Either complete privatization was carried out or majority or minority disinvestment. Majority के अंदर the government would sell more than 51% of its stake, but even then the government would have some decision making powers. But in minority disinvestment, the government would have more than 51% stake with itself. यहाँ पे government has less than 51% as an outcome, and ultimately, of course, because the government has more than 51%, so it still has control over running of that company. So these were the major changes that were brought about under privatization. Secondly, they also carried out autonomy to PSUs. Lot of public sector enterprises were required. Lot of public sector enterprises were not bad for the economy, for the government. They could even be profitable. For example, ONGC could be profitable, is profitable. So these kind of PSUs the government did not want to sell. उन्होंने बोला आप सेल मत करिए, आप इनको ऑटोनॉमी दीजिए, आप इनको ज्यादा इंडिपेंडेंस दीजिए. इंडिपेंडेंस कैसे दोगे? The government said, okay, let's create 3 different ratnas or 3 different tags for these kind of companies. The bigger tag you have, the more autonomy you have, the more investment you can make without government interference. So these 3 different tags were Mini Ratna, Navaratna and Maharatna. We'll understand these 3 very briefly. इसमें कुछ factual information है जिससे आपको समझ आएगा कि exactly इन तीनों में क्या क्या reforms किए गए. And lastly, we carried out some other reforms as well under privatization, which included number 1, voluntary retirement scheme, because the government realized that there is overstaffing when it comes to the number of people working in government enterprises vis-a-vis private companies. So if you want to privatize, or if you want to at least compete with the private sector, you have to reduce this staffing. Government said, let's come out with voluntary retirement scheme where we ask our employees to voluntarily retire. It was also called as golden handshake scheme, जहां पे आपने सरकार ने बोला कि आप रिटायर कर जाइए, हम आपको एक बहुत अच्छा सब्सटैंशियल अमाउंट देंगे, यू कैन गो फॉरवर्ड, go ahead and work in the private sector, and this money will take care of you for the next 4-5 years so that you can be comfortable. And lastly, Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction was brought in for the government sector or public sector units. Now, what is this? Board for Industrial and Financial Reconstruction was set up in 1987, but primarily this BIFR was set up for sick private enterprises which were not doing well. तो अगर कोई प्राइवेट कंपनी है विच इज नॉट डूइंग वेल एंड इट वांट्स टू क्लोज डाउन, देन इट वुड गो टू BIFR बिफोर क्लोजिंग डाउन, जिससे उसके सारे डेट्स वगैरह खत्म हो जाएं. In 1992, after economic reforms, BIFR was also extended to government sector. तो गवर्नमेंट एंटिटीज हैं विच आर सिक एंटिटीज, नॉट डूइंग वेल एट ऑल, प्राइवेटाइज भी नहीं हो पा रही, उनको बेच भी नहीं पा रहे, those companies would go to BIFR और उनका रेजोल्यूशन BIFR के अंदर होगा. So the government companies were finally brought into BIFR. So these were the major steps which were taken in the area of privatization. Let's come to the last one now, which is globalization. But before that, I've already explained what is the difference between privatization and disinvestment. There is a beautiful mind map in front of you which explains it. And next, there is a very good map or chart or mind map which explains to you the difference between Mini Ratna, Navaratna and Maharatna companies. Now what are these? अगर कोई भी पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिट है, एंटिटी है, उसको मिनी रत्ना स्टेटस चाहिए, इट कैन बी ईदर अ कैटेगरी 1 मिनी रत्ना और अ कैटेगरी 2 मिनी रत्ना. अगर उसको कैटेगरी 1 मिनी रत्ना बनना है, देन इट नीड्स टू फुलफिल दीज कंडीशंस. नंबर 1, पिछले 3 साल में एवरेज प्रॉफिटेबल होना चाहिए. नंबर 2, pre-tax profit, which is also called as earning before interest and taxes, EBIT भी बोलते हैं, should be at least 30 crores in the last 1 year, and the net worth should be positive. And if it wants to be a part of category 2 mini ratna, then it should be profitable in the last 3 years, the same as the first one. Positive net worth होना चाहिए. कोई लोन या इंटरेस्ट पे डिफॉल्ट नहीं होना चाहिए. लोन या इंटरेस्ट हो सकता है, बट देयर शुड नॉट बी एनी डिफॉल्ट ऑन दोज लोन्स और इंटरेस्ट, and it should not be dependent on the government for its financing. It should be completely independent, completely autonomous. Then you can get category 2 mini ratna status as well. तो ये mini ratna status के लिए होता है. These are limited to only public sector enterprises which want more autonomy. They try and get these statuses, these tags, so that the government interference reduces and they can work more and more like the private sector. If a company wanted to get Navaratna status, majorly first वाला ज़्यादा important है. Must be a mini ratna 1 or schedule A. mini ratna category 1 में ऑलरेडी होना चाहिए, नंबर 1. एंड देन एक हमने एक टेबल बनाया है, उस टेबल में हमने कुछ पॉइंट्स दिए, तो कुछ वेट असाइंड होते हैं कि इतना वेट होना चाहिए. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, आउट ऑफ 100, 25 पॉइंट्स आर गिवन टू नेट प्रॉफिट टू नेट वर्थ. तो उनका नेट प्रॉफिट टू नेट वर्थ रेशियो जो है उसका वेटेज 25% है, या फिर 25 पॉइंट्स आउट ऑफ 100 पॉइंट्स है. ऐसे ही मैन पावर कॉस्ट टू प्रोडक्शन कॉस्ट 50 पॉइंट उसका वेटेज है. मतलब जो भी उसका टोटल हम लोग एक्सपेंडिचर निकालेंगे, टोटल जो भी उसका 100 को वेट करेंगे, उसमें से मैन पावर कॉस्ट जो है वो 15 पॉइंट्स तक ही होनी चाहिए, उसमें ज्यादा नहीं होनी चाहिए. नेट प्रॉफिट टू नेट वर्थ मिनिमम हमारा 25% होना चाहिए. पीबीडीआईटी मतलब प्रॉफिट बिफोर डेप्रिसिएशन इंटरेस्ट एंड टैक्सेस टू कैपिटल एम्प्लॉयड एटलीस्ट 15% होना चाहिए. ऐसे ही प्रॉफिट बिफोर इंटरेस्ट एंड टैक्स एटलीस्ट 15% ऑफ टर्नओवर होना चाहिए. अर्निंग पर शेयर एटलीस्ट 10 का होना चाहिए. एंड इंटरसेक्टोरल परफॉर्मेंस जो है उसको 20 पॉइंट्स की वेटेज है. मतलब इतना इंटरसेक्टोरल, अलग अलग सेक्टर्स की जो सिमिलर एंटरप्राइजेस हैं, प्राइवेट एंटरप्राइजेस, उसमें इतना वेटेज उसका होना चाहिए. तो दिस वाज गिवन फॉर क्लासिफिकेशन एज अ नवरत्ना कंपनी. एंड लास्टली वी हैव महारत्ना कंपनी. महारत्ना अगर बनना है तो नवरत्ना स्टेटस एटलीस्ट चाहिए आपको, और उसके साथ साथ यू नीड ऑल दीज एज वेल. Number one, you need to be a listed entity. You cannot be a private company anymore. You have to be a public company that is listed on the stock exchange. Turnover in the last 3 years should be an average of 25,000 crore. Net worth in the last 3 years should be an average of 15,000 crore. Net profit should be an average of 5,000 crore. And you are required to have international operations. तो ये सब अगर combine हो जाता है, you automatically get Maharatna status. Okay. This brings us to the end of privatization. Now let's come to globalization. Globalization में हमने क्या क्या changes करने शुरू किए. Globalization में हमने what all did we start doing? Let's try and understand that. तो globalization का brief मतलब था connectivity with the global economy. Whatever steps were taken by the government in order to integrate itself with the global economy would come under globalization. Okay, let's start one by one. Number one, exchange rate reforms. सबसे पहले we shifted from fixed exchange rate to floating exchange rate. By 1994 we had completely shifted to floating exchange rate system, wherein अगर आज let's say dollar to rupees का जो weightage है या फिर exchange rate है, let's say that is right now 70. Tomorrow it can very much be 80 also. It can fall to 80. Nobody is going to do anything. अगर बहुत ज्यादा फॉल होता है, the RBI can come in and try and stabilize it indirectly by reducing or working on the demand and supply of currencies. Directly नहीं कर सकता. It cannot directly say that from tomorrow rupee is going to be at an exchange rate of 80 to 1 only. ऐसा नहीं कर सकता. It has to do that by interfering or intervening in the form of trying to change the demand and supply. वो ये कैसे करता है? It tries to do it by buying or selling of dollars. और इसी के लिए द गवर्नमेंट और आरबीआई यूजेस फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व्स. तो आरबीआई के जो रिजर्व्स हैं अभी $688 billion, those reserves are used for this only. That is the primary purpose. So the first major reform which was carried out in order to globalize with the international community was to shift to a floating exchange rate so that we could import and export freely without any government intervention. That was the primary objective. And secondly, we started or we moved towards full trade account convertibility, which is also called as current account convertibility. We moved from a controlled convertibility to a complete current account convertibility, which means that tomorrow if I want to trade, let's say I want to sell these mics to United States, and I have a big order of 1 million of these. मेरे को बेचने हैं ये 1 million units of these. Every unit costs let's say 2,000 rupees. So I have 2,000 into 10 lakh rupees now coming to me, and when I sell they're going to pay me in dollars, and I'll have to exchange those dollars into rupees. I do not have to take permission of anybody in order to do that. I just have to apply and I just have to export this item. If I've got the license to make the export, I export. And whenever I receive dollars, my bank can easily convert it into rupees. So that is called as complete current account convertibility. We still do not have complete capital account convertibility. मतलब इसका ये है that if you want to invest overseas more than 2,50,000 dollars, then you have to take permission from the government. इतना liberalization कर दिया है जिसको हम बोलते हैं liberalized remittance scheme. But if you want to invest more than this, then you have to take permission from the government. Similarly, if someone else wants to invest in your country, then also they have to take permission in certain areas, and in certain other areas they do not have to take any permission at all. Therefore, current account convertibility is partial. I'm not saying it is not there at all, it is there, but it is still partial. So these were the major exchange rate reforms that were carried out under globalization. Then we have foreign technology. हमने सबसे पहले liberalization में देखा था that foreign technology was allowed into India because it was realized that Indian technology was obsolete. और अगर आपको compete करना है, you need foreign capital, you need foreign machinery, you need latest technology. Automatic approval for industry agreements. This was allowed. If any industry wanted foreign technology, or if any industry wanted to create a technology for which it had to collaborate with any foreign industry, then automatic approvals were allowed. जिससे कि इंडस्ट्रीज अग्रीमेंट कर सकें एक दूसरे के साथ, एंड दे कैन improve their technology so that they can compete globally as well. So the objective of this automatic approval was to allow the companies to enter into agreements so that they can be globally competitive. They can integrate better with the global economy. Fostering development via FDI and tech agreements. जैसे मैंने आपको बताया था, foreign direct investment was allowed into India so that foreign investors could invest in India, and they could specifically invest in foreign technology. वो foreign technology अपनी यहाँ लाएं जिससे कि यहाँ बना सकें. For example, right now the government is in a tussle with Tesla, wherein the government says that if you want to produce, if you want to sell to Indians, then you have to produce in India. And automatically when they start producing in India, they will have to invest in India, number one. And secondly, they will also, even if they're not required to, release their technology, automatically technology adoption for other companies in India will become simpler, है ना. तो जैसे जैसे फॉरेन टेस्ला की प्रोडक्ट्स यहाँ पर आएंगे, ऑटोमेटिकली उनकी टेक्नोलॉजी भी लोगों को समझ आएगी, यहाँ के बिजनेसमैन को समझ आएगी. दे विल बी एबल टू अडॉप्ट और अडेप्ट टू दैट टेक्नोलॉजी एज वेल. तो उससे इंडिजनाइज भी होगा हमारा प्रोडक्शन. So these were the major reforms in globalization, exchange rate and foreign technology. The next major reforms in globalization or integration with global economy was import liberalization. इसमें हमने क्या किया? सबसे पहले we were told in fact to become a member of World Trade Organization, जो हमें बोलता है that you cannot, number one, charge more than a certain percentage of taxes or tariffs on imports and exports of goods and services. You have to completely remove नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स, मतलब क्वांटिटेटिव बैरियर्स. पहले क्या होता था? क्वांटिटेटिव बैरियर्स होते थे, मतलब इफ यू वांट टू इंपोर्ट मोर देन लेट्स से 2000 कंप्यूटर्स, यू कांट डू दैट. सो इन द एंटायर कंट्री इन 1 ईयर ओनली 2000 कंप्यूटर्स कुड बी इंपोर्टेड. अब वो किसी एक कंपनी ने ले लिए तो फिर कोई और कंपनी नहीं ले पाएगी. दैट वाज अ क्वांटिटेटिव restriction, also called as a non-tariff barrier. Those were asked to completely be removed. Secondly, उन्होंने बोला टैरिफ्स जितने भी आप चार्ज करते हैं उनको लिबरलाइज करिए, उनको कम करिए, सो दैट मोर companies can import from you and they can also export to you, because integration will not happen only by exporting. It will also happen when other countries are allowed to export to India. So, or India will have to import certain goods or services. So under this, under WTO membership, इंपोर्ट लाइसेंसिंग हमने बंद करी जिससे कि ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा लोग और कंपनीज इंपोर्ट कर सकें. हमने वी रिड्यूस टैरिफ्स एंड नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स एंड वी रिड्यूस्ड वेरियस कस्टम ड्यूटीज एज वेल, विच कम्स अंडर टैरिफ बैरियर्स ओनली. So these were the major import liberalization measures. आपको लगेगा ये liberalization के अंदर आएगा, बट नहीं, ये मेजरली ग्लोबलाइजेशन के अंदर आएगा. Why? Because the objective of reducing tariffs was to integrate with the global economy and to allow the global economy to integrate with you. And lastly, the reforms under globalization were foreign investment, where foreign direct investors, which means investors who wanted to create companies in India or invest in Indian companies, were allowed to invest up to 51%. अब ये 100% हो गया बहुत सारी कंपनीज में, एंड थोड़ा बहुत अप्रूवल लेना पड़ता है इन सम स्ट्रेटेजिक एंटरप्राइजेस, and foreign institutional investors are also allowed. In fact, India is one of the largest foreign institutional investor recipients right now in the world. So these were the major reforms carried out under globalization. अब हमने ये तो समझ लिया, बट दिस इज नॉट ऑल. व्हाई? बिकॉज हमें आजकल जो क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं वो खाली एलपीजी रिफॉर्म्स के इस क्लासिफिकेशन से नहीं आ रहे हैं. देयर इज अनदर वे टू क्लासिफाई एलपीजी रिफॉर्म्स. द रिफॉर्म्स आर नॉट गोइंग टू चेंज, सो इट विल बी अ फास्ट discussion, probably the next 10 minutes. But what has happened is we have tried to understand LPG reforms from a different direction. पहले हम देखते थे खाली कि लिबरलाइज कर दिया, प्राइवेटाइज कर दिया, ग्लोबलाइज कर दिया. Now we are saying the reforms were of two kinds. There were stabilization reforms, which were immediate reforms. The objective of these reforms was to bring out immediate relief to the Indian economy. And then there were structural reforms. The objective of those reforms were to carry out long run structural changes in Indian economy so that Indian economy would not get into a crisis situation yet again. इसीलिए दो टाइप के रिफॉर्म्स में क्लासिफिकेशन हम कर सकते हैं एलपीजी को भी. वन वर इमीडिएट रिलीफ रिफॉर्म्स एंड द सेकंड वर स्ट्रक्चरल लॉन्ग रन चेंजेस दैट वर कैरिड आउट. अगर इमीडिएट या स्टेबलाइजेशन मेजर्स पे देखें, सबसे पहले हमने अपने टैक्स स्ट्रक्चर्स को चेंज किया. मतलब हमने इनकम टैक्स कम किया. द एवरेज इनकम टैक्स वाज 51% ऑन इंडिविजुअल्स एंड कंपनीज. इट वाज ब्रॉट डाउन टू 30%. नाउ इट इज इवन लेसर. हमने पीक टैरिफ्स, मतलब जो इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट पे टैरिफ्स लगते हैं, उनको कम किया. और हमने कंपनीज पे जो टैक्स लगाए जाते हैं उनको भी कम किया. नाउ दीज वर इमीडिएट चेंजेस दैट कुड बी ब्रॉट अबाउट ओवरनाइट. That is why they are placed under immediate demand side economic reforms भी इनको बोलते हैं. Secondly, हमने क्या किया? Fiscal correction किया. मतलब it means that the government said that we will reduce our non-planned expenditures and we will reduce our subsidies. Basically, the government promised that it will work on its expenditures. अब government expenditure कम करेगी तो the supply of money in the economy is going to reduce automatically. When the supply of money will reduce, then automatically inflation will come under control. So because of fiscal correction, which was also an immediate reform, inflation also came under control. Okay. And lastly, immediate reform जो हमने किया वो BOP, balance of payment improvement किया. मतलब हमने अपने imports और exports को liberalize किया under balance of payment, which meant that we immediately opened trade. Anybody could now import, anybody could now export whatever they wanted. So these were called as liberalization of import and export or BOP improvement reforms. They were carried out immediately. इसमें जो policy changes होंगे वो काफी time लगेगा. They would have taken longer time period and they would have come under or they will come under structural reforms. But हमने कुछ immediate changes भी किए so that trade could be carried out freely between India and other nations. We try to increase capital flows. जो मैंने बताया आपको FDI, FII norms के अंदर या changes के अंदर हमने बोला कि जो भी इंडिया में इन्वेस्ट करना चाहता है they can do so. If Indians want to invest outside, they can do so as well. So for example, we started with a liberalization remittance scheme of $25,000 and now we have changed it further multiple times and now it stands at $250,000. Exchange rate हमने धीरे धीरे चेंज करना शुरू किया. वी फॉलोड अ फिक्स्ड एक्सचेंज रेट सिस्टम, देन वी फॉलोड अ मैनेज्ड एक्सचेंज रेट सिस्टम. बाय 1994 वी हैड मूव टुवर्ड्स अ कंप्लीटली फ्लोटिंग एक्सचेंज रेट सिस्टम एंड वी आल्सो डिसाइडेड टू इमीडिएटली डीवैल्यू आवर करेंसी. मतलब उस टाइम पे फॉर एग्जांपल इफ $1 वाज इक्वल टू 6 rupees, इट वाज टू एक्सपेंसिव, वी कुड नॉट एक्सपोर्ट एट दिस रेट. द गवर्नमेंट सेड ओके, फॉर द टाइम बीइंग नेक्स्ट 3 years लेट्स डीवैल्यू इट एंड मेक इट एट 30 instead of ₹6. So they devalued instead of depreciation. We are calling it as devaluation because the government did it, not the market. Market पे हमने कब छोड़ा? 1994 onwards we completely left it for the market to decide whatever the Indian currency rate would be. Okay. So these are the reforms under stabilization reforms or immediate reforms. And last we have structural reforms, long term reforms. इसमें हमने क्या क्या reforms किए? This is the last thing that we're going to discuss today. Number one, फॉरेन ट्रेड एंड इन्वेस्टमेंट रिफॉर्म्स. हमने इंपोर्ट पे जो भी रेस्ट्रिक्शंस थे वो हटाने शुरू किए. अब पहले क्या होता था, अगर आपको कुछ इंपोर्ट करना है यू कैन इंपोर्ट इट टू अ सर्टेन एक्सटेंट. और यू कैन इम्पोर्ट इट टू अप टू सर्टन वैल्यू। तो हम बहुत सारे टैरिफ एंड नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स लगाते थे। उन सबको हटाने के लिए हमें पॉलिसी चेंजेस करने पड़ते, ऐसा नहीं कि हमने ओवरनाइट चेंज कर दिया। वी अलाउड इम्पोर्ट एंड एक्सपोर्ट in a lot of areas, but even then a lot of policy changes were required, long term changes were required. That process was started. That is why removal of import restrictions comes under foreign trade reforms, which are also structural reforms, because उसमें काफी time लगा। Full current account convertibility was ultimately achieved in phases, जैसे मैंने आपको बताया already, and independent regulators were set up. For example, as I told you, SEBI and IRDAI and various other enterprises were set up, autonomous regulators. The idea was that you can invest easily in India, you can trade with India, to and fro from India without interference of the government. फिर हमने इंडस्ट्रियल सेक्टर लॉन्ग टर्म रिफॉर्म्स किए, जहां पे हमने इंडस्ट्रियल लाइसेंसिंग को सबसे पहले खत्म किया। राइट नाउ लाइसेंसिंग इनफैक्ट ओनली फॉर टू डिफरेंट सेक्टर्स, only the government can invest in these sectors or carry out industries. These are atomic energy and railways. Other than this, other than railways and atomic energy, every sector is open to the private sector. So industrial licensing overall धीरे धीरे liberalize हो गई है. Under this only, we also opened space for the private sector to set up their shops in the banking area. So in 1993, we had the first round of licenses being given to banks by RBI, then again in 2001, then again in 2013. And after that, we completely liberalized it by saying that now we have on-tap licensing. You can apply whenever you want. You might say, sir, licensing की क्या ज़रूरत है? ज़रूरत है because a bank is a very sensitive area. And therefore, RBI needs to be sure कि जो भी बैंक खड़ा कर रहा है वो एक्चुअली लोगों के पैसे लेके भाग नहीं जाएगा। Therefore, licensing is required in that area. But now we have on-tap licensing. Secondly, industrial sector reforms में public sector को हमने धीरे धीरे कॉन्ट्रैक्ट किया। लास्ट कॉफिन वॉज ऑफ एयर इंडिया, कि हमने एयर इंडिया को भी बेच दिया। पब्लिक सेक्टर धीरे धीरे कॉन्ट्रैक्ट करना शुरू हुआ एंड वी स्टार्टेड गिविंग द रेंस of the economy to the private sector. And we finally replaced MRTP, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Policies Act. As I said, structural reforms मतलब long term reforms, तो हमने MRTP Act खत्म किया and we replaced it with Competition Commission of India. MRTP का फोकस क्या था? मोनोपोली क्रिएट होने से बचाना। Competition Commission of India का ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है? कंपटीशन को प्रमोट करना। So it is more positive rather than negative. So even if a company is too big, MRTP would have restricted that company, but CCI will not unless it is restricting competition in a certain way. Okay. And lastly, we carried out financial sector reforms under structural reforms. Establishment of private banks, जो मैंने आपको explain कर दिया है. Market determined interest rates. तो पहले interest rates administered होते थे, मतलब the government would decide what the interest rate at which banks would give loans to the people would be. These were called as administered interest rate regime. It was changed and transformed to market determined interest rate regime. Right now the market determines interest rate, not the government. We also removed crop subsidization. What that means is, before 1991 a farmer would get a loan at 12%, but somebody like Vijay Mallya would get a loan at 6%. Now he's getting loan at below cost. That means the government is in loss here, or the bank is in loss here. अब वो रिकवरी कहाँ से हो रही है? गरीब आदमी से हो रही है। This is called as cross subsidization. This was also removed. Now it doesn't matter who are you. Even if you are rich, even if your profile is very very good, you will not get loan at a very cheap rate. आपका interest rate किसी और से recover नहीं करेंगे. Reduce government interference in the financial sector by giving more powers to entities like RBI and SEBI. And finally, CRR and SLR were reduced. SLR used to be somewhere around 40 to 50%. Now it is at 21%. CRR has come down to just 4%. तो ये reduce किया so that indirect measures of monetary policy could be followed by RBI. पहले direct measures follow होते थे, यहाँ पे CRR और SLR के through ही RBI control करता था money supply economy. Now they have changed to indirect measures and not direct measures. Indirect measures में क्या आते हैं? Policy rates like repo rate and reverse repo rate. So these were the major changes, reforms which were carried out as a part of economic reforms in 1991. I hope it was a good session for you. I hope you learned something new. And I'm very sure that through more such sessions, we'll keep learning more and more things. This is all from my side. If you have anything to say, you can pen it down in the comment section below. I will try and read as many comments as possible. And I'll see you very soon. Till then, all the best.